All right. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Iryna Pravilova. I'm a professor of history at Princeton University. I'm also acting director of Princeton's Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. This program is sponsored by Princeton Institute in International Regional Studies. I would like to use this opportunity first, before I pass the floor to Iryna and our guests, to advertise our program and our website. Last year, we ran a series of events on collecting art in Imperial Russia, and another series on contemporary politics in Russia. And the recordings of these lectures are all available online. So please check the website and the Facebook page of Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies Center at Princeton. This year, we shift our focus from Russia to Ukraine. And we have a wonderful colleague, Iryna Vushko, who is assistant professor of history at Princeton University. And she will run the series of these talks and events. First in the fall, we'll start on Zoom. And then hopefully in the spring, we'll go live and hybrid. So both the Zoom option and the in-person option will be available. And again, this event, is all other events, is being recorded, so you can always come back and listen to the talk again. So on this note, I will pass it to Iryna, who will introduce our speakers today.
Hello all. So my name is Iryna Vushko. I teach Eastern European history here at Princeton, and welcome all I'm basically personally in Princeton, but wherever you are, and I know you're all in different time zones. So it's my great pleasure to start off a series of events, as Katya Privilova mentioned, on Ukraine, and we are starting on with a panel discussion on disinformation and cyber warfare, specifically with the focus on Ukraine. And I know most of you probably seen the poster. We unfortunately lost one of our panelists, Kurt Volker, who was announced as the first panelist here, couldn't make it today, unfortunately. So we restructured it a little bit. There are going to be 3 of us today. Well, I will do my participation will be very limited. But it's my pleasure to introduce 2 people who are here with us today. Dmytro Shymkiv is joining us from Kyiv, where it's almost midnight, so we are particularly grateful for that. He's executive chairman of Dmytro Group, which is a major pharmaceutical company in Ukraine, but generally is a businessman and innovator with 20 years of experience, with senior leadership experience in Ukraine and Europe and in the US. We are specifically interested in his experience today for, the greatest relevance of his presence today is particularly relevant because he served for several years as a deputy head of the presidential administration of Ukraine, not the current one, but those of you who follow the events in Ukraine under the previous president, Petro Poroshenko, and also during under Petro Poroshenko, he served as secretary of the National Reforms and Investment Council for the presidents of Ukraine. Right. As before that, he also worked as 5 years as general manager of Microsoft Ukraine, one of the largest branch of Microsoft in the world, one of the most successful from what I've read. So we're very, very grateful to have him here today. Our other panelist is Peter Pomerantsev, who is a senior fellow at Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. So Peter Pomerantsev is a British, how would I say it? It's a British journalist and writer and intellectual with Russian family roots. And he's most famous, if I'm allowed to say this, for his 2 books, whom a lot of us probably have read, on the meaning of truth and propaganda, specifically on the Russian context, right? And if you didn't have a chance to read it, please do. It's a great fun to read. It's not just it's not just very knowledgeable account of what is going on in Russia, but it's a very nuanced and a fun read for all of us to understand what's going on in that part of the world. So one of the first book is what's the title? Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, and it won all kind of prizes, which I won't be mentioning now. And another book in 2019, the most recent book. This is not propaganda, and also is kind of nominated, got all kind of awards. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our two speakers today, and I'll just say, a few words about what's going to happen today and how we are going to proceed. So we have two panelists, and the way that we envision this panel is basically a discussion-based conversation. So they will spend probably 20 minutes, each of them will have spend some time talking about whatever they want to say. Then I will open up a discussion by some questions to them, and then after that we will open up questions to the audience. On the technical side, there's also a lot of you probably more familiar than me than this technology, but I just wanted to point out that we will be using the Q&A function for questions. So if you want to pose a question that is related to the discussion, please post it in the Q&A section, right? And then there's going to be no direct questions from the audience. I will read the questions to the speaker, right? The chat question that I've noticed some of you already start using, we'll only use it for technical issues. So for example, if you don't hear us or if you can't see us, so please post your comments in the chat. Otherwise, questions that are directed, that are relevant to the discussion today will follow the Q&A. Okay, and so it's my pleasure to pass the floor to Dmytro Shymkiv, and hopefully you'll have a great night today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Iryna. Peter, great to see having you, to be in the panel with you. Read your books, very impressive. What I would like to start talking about is a topic of the cybersecurity. And I will try to touch the new ways of the cyber warfare that's been evolving over the last several years, where Ukraine became a playground for the new forms. A few years ago, at the hearing in the Senate about Russian aggression in Ukraine, the General Charles Cleveland mentioned, actually accepted that all the time we've been focusing on the four main areas of military operation. It's land, water, and space. But there is two new forms, which actually the whole world greatly missed while Russia advanced their strengths. Is a human and it's a cyber. And human can become actually a weapon very well used. And I will go through the cases that happened in Ukraine just to give a glimpse and understanding what's really happened and how it happened and how it can be used. The first thing when I will be mentioning a lot of cyber case in the cyber world or cyber warfare, we usually use a word attribution. The main reason why this word is used is because normally in majority of the cases, you need to have a fully bulletproof stories that we can point it back to Russia. And as Mr. Peskov usually responded to some of my allegation, do you have any proof? If you don't have any proof, it's not us. So we've seen it, we are not there, these famous claims of Russia. Nevertheless, the cases are here, and the great beneficiary of all these cases is Russian Federation. So if you look at the primary targets and primary approach that's been executed by Russia in a lot of cases, it's actually 5D. It's destroy, deny, degrade, disrupt, and deceive. And this is all complex thing because all these elements like denial of service or denial of operation, degrading in infrastructure, creates a disruption and deception. All these elements actually comprise an approach which can influence the behavior of individuals or members of the society. They can influence the attitudes of this society towards political elites or to the government, And all of this would lead to the different transformation that will usually happen in democratic world. And all this will happen using not just cyber, because you will all very often hear things like it's done just by a cyber. No, cyber is always synchronized with real events. So events that are taking place in the physical world, either it's military operation or it's a diplomatic negotiations or voting in the parliaments or different events. So activities in cyber, in media, any diversion and diversion on the physical and the front lines will always be synchronized. And I'm going to prove it through the few cases that now we dive in. Very often we say it started in Ukraine. Actually, no, it started with Estonia. It started with Estonia in 2007, when Estonia decided to move a Soviet monument. An attack that was being followed put down the whole country for a month, which was a fully digitally connected country with lack of services, lack of infrastructure, non-functioning services, that for 1 month. The attack on Estonia ended on the 9th of May, a surprise, an interesting day, which is Victory Day in Russia. The next attack was Georgia, 2008. Activities that have been done in cyberspace to shut down the media sites and a denial of service to a lot of cyber infrastructure in Georgia was synchronous with military aggression on Georgia. But now let's look at the Ukrainian cases. And Ukrainian cases, I will go through the first big bucket. It's called critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure is something we all depend. It can create a lot of fear if it's malfunctioning. And Ukraine was a very obvious reason to play and test, because if things work in Ukraine and later you could measure the reaction of the people and the disruption, you would immediately try to test it elsewhere. And that actually happened. So first, we will start with electrical grid. 2015, attack on electrical grid in Ukraine. Blackouts in 2 major power stations, Chernivtsi and Prikarpatia. This is Western Ukraine, close to Hungarian border. A lot of multinational population with different attitudes towards central government. Shut down. 230,000 people were out of electricity between 1 to 6 hours. Hospitals, all infrastructure was out of power. You couldn't do surgery, you couldn't do anything. Think about this. The similar attack was also happening on Kiev Oblenergo. It lasted very shortly. The way how it looked, because I was part of an investigation in this moment and worked with US government and FBI, which was invited to help us on this particular case, and the Department of Energy. Imagine you're operator of the plant, power plant, and suddenly you see, like in the movie, the mice is moving across the different filters on the screen and switching off the system. Later, the similar virus was found in a power station in Israel and United States. And we cooperated a lot with Department of Energy in the United States to prevent the similar aggression on the electrical grid. The next, the finance infrastructure, 2016. Besides attack on the banks and National Bank of Ukraine, shutting down some of the servers, another attack was also, we all heard of as NotPetya. NotPetya attack, it's a virus which shut down significantly a lot of infrastructure for majority of the business. Almost all government infrastructure was shut down from it's basically PCs. Cabinet of Ministers couldn't operate, but more than 10% of the whole country business infrastructure was down. ATMs that were using particular code could not work. We saw this in the media stations where people suddenly their whole screens went black. Hospitals couldn't operate, especially computers that operate in infrastructure in the hospitals couldn't do this. Grocery stores couldn't operate because teller machines have been software running in. But it's why finance? NotPetya was the final stage as a part of investigation that was done. NotPetya was a final stage in the whole attack. Everything started much earlier. And the backbone of the attack was the software, which majority, 80% of Ukrainian businesses been using. It's a tax submission software. So it's basically software with which you submit your information about the tax declaration every quarter to the tax authority. That software was compromised on the server which was distributing updates. As a result, that's been spread to all businesses. But first, before burning infrastructure, it was extracting information. And we all know on which computers the software for integration with tax authorities sits. It's CFOs, it's chief accountants, many contract, all data, all financial data of the biggest companies in Ukraine and small and medium businesses being extracted. It's been recorded as a part of the protocol that this been used. And when all information being extracted, the special payload was loaded with ransomware without zero deciphering. So basically, it's very traditional. Sometimes if you look, you rob the village, then you burn the village. So that was a strategy of finance attack in 2016. Transportation attack, 2017. That was recorded by actually US Maritime Service and many captains that were sailing ships in Black Sea. Suddenly, their GPS system was distorted on a significant territory. And their ships, which were in Black Sea, could identify themselves as on the land. The disruption on GPS system and interference with GPS system was an experiment which was run in 2017. 2014, telecom, with a start of attack on Ukraine in Crimea and Donetsk-Lugansk region, the infrastructure of telecom operators was connected to the central, their infrastructure on these territories was connected to central infrastructure. So hijacking the territory means hijacking infrastructure and being able to interfere with telecom infrastructure in Ukraine. All telecom operators jumped in and shut down the infrastructure, but some of the attack and extraction of the records of the mobile subscribers was actually used. Later, it's been used to attack soldiers on the front line with the messages, with the fake calls, etc. Moving further, political infrastructure, very critical for the country. 2014 elections, just the war started. Poroshenko is running for presidency. Attack was done on the central electoral system, where at the moment where the presentation was done about the election, suddenly the big screen behind the main people reporting on the results was showing a fake image that the far-right candidate won. That was not needed for Ukrainian media. That was needed for Russian media to broadcast a story that in Ukraine, the far right are winning elections, which was not true, but it was necessary to produce an image that would later be used as a propaganda machine. Social and media networks. We're going to talk it in the second part of the story. Energy. And this is interesting. In 2017, another energy attack took place, but this time it was done not in Ukraine. And I'm going to tell you the story which you could not Google. You can Google the story that in Austria, in hub, which is major gas transaction hub, was explosion. One person died. That was happening exactly at the same moment where there was this hearing in the Bundestag in Germany, about Nord Stream 2, exactly at the same time. The explosion resulted in the lack of supply to Italy, lack of supply to Slovakia, and lack of supply to a lot of countries in Europe. No attribution, no investigation. I can give you a very assurance. It was the result of this explosion was a cyber attack on the pipe infrastructure, where the power and temperature sensors were compromised. So the nature of my work was also involved with the cybersecurity activities that happened in Ukraine. And I cooperated a lot with US authorities on the majority of these cases. So this is part of the critical infrastructure. Why critical infrastructure? Critical infrastructure is something that when disrupted, threats, people are afraid, people are concerned, people raise questions, and then they go and attack, raise voices, dissatisfaction, disruption, etc. But social platform is another big bucket, because this, I'm going to give a few items, but I believe Peter's going to cover this much more. So it's meddling with public opinions, social media networks. We know famous Twitter and Facebook, but you can also have tons of bots that can play on the social media. And it's very important, because I was the one who was doing negotiation with meeting Facebook in 2014, following addressing of the president of Ukraine to Mike Zuckerberg, particularly about the situation with the trolls and bot farms that been working on this case in Ukraine. By that time, there was nothing on Facebook that could distinguish sponsored ads from normal posts. And that's been used very creatively to target audiences, to create fake stories, to primarily targeting trust of people, cyber attack. But they also, Russia has their own social media. Okay, Odnoklassniki, so something like classmates, and VK, Vkontakte. These two networks were covering 20 million people in Ukraine. If you think that out of 35 million citizens of Ukraine, 20 million been part of the Russian managed social networks that has access to the profiles, connectivity, and you can, having a profile of your social Facebook or social media, you can easily construct who you are, what you do, what's your preferences, etc. And then you can easily manipulate it. Back in 2013, the investigation in Russia about Vkontakte, VK, was proven by Russian investigative journalists that FSB was actively involved in the design and operation of Vkontakte. So having this social media, you can construct messages, you can manipulate opinion, you can trigger opinion. So social and cyber can go hand in hand, attacking people, attacking infrastructure, attacking country. Later, we've seen it in United States. We've seen similar attack in Montenegro, Kyrgyzstan, France, Qatar, and all these cases been happening after. And all these elements of attack on infrastructure was there. Special viruses were written for individuals to intelligence gathering. When I came to presidential administration, there was 2 primary departments attacked in the administration of the president with especially written viruses for individuals. It's usually international relations and those who are working with the military. These were the primary target of extraction of information. We also had a case where one of the very important ministry for the country being compromised on the routers, and they basically emails that were going in and out of this ministry being read for a couple of years by the hackers attributed to the Cozy Bear team, FET28. So this is what I'm trying to give you, a perspective of all these cases. And later we've seen things going on and on around the globe with the similar stories. We all now know about attack on political infrastructure in the United States. We all know about attack on for example, I mentioned Kyrgyzstan, where Kyrgyzstan shut down the US airbase, basically denial any flights for Central Asia for US military. We have attacks on the Qatar, several companies, and all this is usually connected with very clear political reasons and very clear focus and priorities of Russian government. So we always, when we talk about cyber, we shouldn't look at only cyber from the technical perspective. We always need to look for the reason, what this would lead to, how it can disrupt trust, what next steps. Russia is a very strong player, very professional, a lot of highly technical skills. The country invested in the technical capabilities for many, many years, primary to support their political agenda globally. And we need to, the world was not ready to take and respond to this. During my tenure, I worked a lot with United States, US government, but also with US senators. In 2017, we managed to pass the Ukrainian Cybersecurity Cooperation Act. And there's a couple of senators I want to mention. It's Boyle, Fitzparker, Royce, and Hurd. Great, talented professional with whom we worked hard to actually work and build capabilities of Ukraine to respond to this and to share all the experience and learnings that happen in Ukraine with counterparts around the globe, from Germany, in Holland, in United States, Britain, etc. New laws, new awareness, new capability, and new skills. That's the only way to address it. But I can tell you, back in 2014, 15, 16, that was a scary thing to watch. I will be happy to answer the question and continue the discussion as we progress. If on any particular case that I mentioned was more details. Iryna, I think.
Yep. Thank you very much, Dmytro. Yeah, because I was muted. That was great, and we'll continue. As you said, we'll continue the discussion. And now I'd like to pass the floor to Peter, who I think is going to do PowerPoints. Is it correct?
Yeah, I thought I would do some PowerPoints. I'm going to talk about the disinformation and propaganda threat to kind of continue from Dmytro's theme. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. As you quite rightly said, I'm largely known to the extent that I'm known for my books, but my day job is actually at universities trying to work out why are various propaganda efforts by Russia and other forces, why they're successful, what audience prejudices do they play on, and then working with independent media to try to reach what are sometimes known as vulnerable audiences and strengthen the democratic public sphere. So we're less interested in kind of revealing the latest bot campaigns. There's a lot of people doing that already, where we're actually looking much more at audiences and how one brings them in, and why the other side's propaganda is working. So let me try to share a screen. I just want to go through a project that we did in Ukraine over the kind of the COVID year, really. Right, so that's not opening clearly. Let me try. I don't know what to do now. It doesn't seem to see the document that I've got open. Hold on, let me open it more aggressively on my screen and see if that helps. Okay, let me try. Bear with me for a second. As I do this, here we go. Now, is that big? Is that big enough, or are you just seeing that as a tiny bit of the screen?
Great. No, it's great. It's great.
Okay, so just introducing us very quickly. We're called Iryna. Very confusingly, we're now Iryna, which is a program within Agora at Johns Hopkins University. So a lot of classical references there to a healthy public sphere. And we kind of, our aim is to sort of find very pragmatic ways to overcome the hydras of disinformation and polarization. And we do a little bit of the sort of defensive analysis of disinformation campaigns. But as I said, we're much more into sort of working with independent media to develop innovative ways to overcome polarization and disinformation. We work in lots of large European countries, but a lot in Ukraine, really a lot in Ukraine. I'd say really over the last year, over half our projects have been in Ukraine. And this is just one of several that we've done in Ukraine. Now, we were very interested in the development of Kremlin or Kremlin-aligned propaganda narratives in Ukraine, because everybody here, I think, on this call in this audience as an expert, but just to remind ourselves, so, back during the initial invasion and information aggression of Russia against Ukraine, a lot of the narrative were, trying to split Ukrainians into pro-Russian, the Russian world versus pro-Western, or trying to promote how great the Russian world is or how great Vladimir Putin is. And that's become a much harder sell in Ukraine since Russia's invasion. I mean, we see lots and lots of polling which shows that it's hard to really sell Putin as a positive image around beyond a very sort of revanchist bubble, and certainly can't do that publicly. Maybe you even think that secretly, but pushing that and having people share that is really, really hard. There's been a very severe cooling off of positive attitudes towards Russia. So the sort of pro-Kremlin and Kremlin-aligned narratives, because of course a lot of the people pushing these narratives are Ukrainian citizens who just happen to be financially and often family related to Vladimir Putin's clique. They're not so much pro-Russian as just subtly anti-Western. They're trying to equate Russia and the West, saying they're just as bad as each other. Instead of saying Russia is great, they'll say the West is evil. They'll say the IMF is trying to destroy Ukraine with its reforms. They'll say Ukraine is being taken over by a conspiracy of secret Western advisors who are manipulating Ukraine and wanting to take away its land, impoverish it, destroy its population. In order to look at these narratives, we did a mixture of things. We did some media monitoring, social media analysis. We worked with the University of Zurich to do some polling to see where these narratives are spreading across Ukraine. And then we did the most interesting stuff, which is some social research to try to understand why they're successful. So the main narrative we looked at is, and I'll sort of do them in English and a bit in Russian as well. Ukraine is now under the external governance of Western curators. Now, everybody who knows Soviet history will know this is a narrative straight out of Soviet kind of propaganda, Западные кураторы who secretly manipulate society, and the Sorosyata, the children of Soros, who are secretly running Ukraine. And we found 40% of Ukrainians believe this narrative. Then the Soros and the IMF want to exploit Ukrainian land. It's a very specific one. This isn't just criticism of the IMF, which I think is perfectly legitimate and often, I think, justified. We're talking about a very specific thing that the IMF wants to steal Ukrainian lands and give it to the children of Soros. So 40% around of Ukrainians believe this narrative. Then we're getting into sort of even more exotic things, that the US deploys a network of biolabs in Ukraine to experiment with biological weapons on the Ukrainian population. That's a little bit more out there, but still, a quarter of Ukrainians we found believe this narrative. And then there's another very dangerous one that comes along with that the Ukraine trades more with Russia than the EU. That's a very common false claim that you hear from Kremlin and Kremlin-aligned narratives. And 40% of Ukrainians believe that EU integration brought no benefits to Ukraine. I mean, that's not a specific sort of, propaganda narrative, but it's a very, very interesting statistic that's playing on a lot of different narratives. Now, when we looked at where these narratives were popular across the country, this was very interesting for us because we really wanted to see, are these narratives, are they leaving the usual pro-Russian bubble? I mean, we'd expect to see a lot of anti-Western segments among audiences in maybe in the Donbass, maybe in the South. That's traditionally been places where we've seen a lot of pro-Russian or pro-Kremlin or Kremlin-aligned propaganda narratives. And they're certainly popular in the South and East, but they've left those spaces. These narratives, I think, are much more insidious, much more dangerous than the old pro-Putin ones. Because, everybody in the West and the center would be very hostile to overt Russian world and pro-Putin narratives. We're seeing these narratives leave that bubble and take hold, especially in the west of the country. So I think in terms of success, they're much more successful, much more dangerous, much more insidious than the old Putin riding around on a horse looking sexy sort of nonsense that the Russians were spreading. I won't break, I mean, you can, if the real kind of political nerds, we break it down by political party as well. I mean, here you see stuff that's very, very pointed. People who vote for the pro-Kremlin or Kremlin aligned or Kremlin flirting, or I don't know how to call them while maintaining a BBC and impartial light language. But people who vote, for example, for the party of Shari are really likely to believe these narratives. Opposition party also lean towards that, much less likely if voting for Holos or for European solidarity. But again, servants of the people, you know, a large chunk of people voting for, by far and away, the largest party in the last election were believe these narratives. Now, then we broke it up by media. What are people watching in order to believe these narratives? So we did our polling just before the Medvedchuk channels were essentially taken off air. And that was by far and away the biggest indicator. So it wasn't actually social media. It was good old-fashioned TV. So people who watched the channels of Viktor Medvedchuk, which were overtly pushing these narratives. I think Medvedchuk himself was pushing a couple of these narratives. They were almost twice as likely to trust these lines. For those of you who don't know, I assume everybody knows on the call, but just in case you don't know, Viktor Medvedchuk is a Ukrainian citizen, Ukrainian oligarch, who is essentially a relative of Vladimir Putin. So he's a godfather to his children, and is openly pro-Kremlin and pro-Putin in his rhetoric and positions. His channels have been taken off air through, following charges of supporting terrorism in the Far East. But a lot of these narratives have since migrated to other channels. So I don't think just because these channels have been taken on air, these narratives are going to disappear. They'll migrate somewhere else. But just to be very clear, TV is much more important in this than online. Though Victor is quite right, the spread of social media and bots and trolls and fake accounts obviously has a very, very nefarious impact, especially when it's used in a very focused way in partnership with military operations. Overall, people online are actually much more skeptical of these narratives. And we are talking about TV watching, maybe older populations that are more into them. Though we'll get into the social breakdown in a second. It's full of fun surprises. Now, who believes them? We've looked at the regional thing. We've looked at the media consumption. So I don't know, I suspect a lot of people on this call have PhDs, and I'd like to tell you that you are among the most likely people to believe conspiratorial propaganda. To be honest, there isn't actually a very strong educational correlation generally. It really isn't like, oh, people with high education don't believe it much more, and people with low education believe it much less. You actually have people in all segments, in all educational segments, believing these narratives, but the most likely ones are people with virtually no education and people with PhDs. Those are the two most likely. But we didn't generally find that, and I don't know whether in the university community you've noticed a lot of conspiracy theorists, but maybe some of you them are even with us today. But overall, education isn't a really strong, a very strong indicator. Kind of statuses, social statuses. So the unemployed and the retired are much more likely to believe in them, and older people as well. So I think that's something to do with status, with being on the fringes of society, not being very active in society. Those sort of things are much more important than education. Very clearly in the social media monitoring, we found that actually social media, if we are going to get into it, splits up very interestingly in Ukraine. Twitter is more pro-Western, while Facebook and Telegram are more anti-Western. And Telegram, when we were looking at it, was definitely the thing to watch. Telegram, content on Telegram was getting a lot of pickup, often Telegram sort of seeding things in other parts of social media. So Telegram channels, which are, as we say, often more Kremlin aligned, are the new interesting space to watch, while Facebook is a bit of a bastion for more pro-Western views. So even social media platforms are sort of, being split in various ways. But listen, this kind of monitoring is fine, but the real juice for me, the real kind of like interesting stuff always comes through in focus groups. And we did focus groups based on a segmentation that we'd done on a previous project about history that split up society into various groups. But we were completely very, very much focused in this analysis on not just on the groups who we would expect to be into this narrative, which would be slightly, Russian-leaning groups in the south and east. We would expect them to be on board with this narrative. We were much more interested in talking to people in Kiev, in Western Ukraine, who we would think would be resistant to the usual Kremlin propaganda lines. And here was very interesting, especially people sort of in rural Western Ukraine, people who are very anti-Russian, people who are very sympathetic to the Maidan. They had very, very interesting attitudes towards these narratives. So, by the way, look, this is why polling is such a can only ever be the start of an investigation like this. When you actually talk to people, they have a very nuanced attitude to these narratives. They understand they're probably pro-Russian narratives. They understand they might well be being seeded by Kremlin-aligned figures. They're ambivalent towards them. They're often, by the way, very confused. I mean, nobody actually knew what children of Soros were. They were very, very confused about Soros, isn't that Freemasons or something? I mean, a lot of this language actually goes over people's heads. However, even when they said, look, we don't know if the Soros children are really taking over. We don't know if the IMF really wants to take away our land, though we do know the IMF is evil. But we don't know what exactly they want. But they'd agree with the overall sense that Ukraine is surrounded by enemies, that we live in a dog-eat-dog world, a world of hyper-competition, where the Russians want something from us, the West wants something from us. They were very skeptical of any kind of Western assistance. And the metaphor they'd used would be, well, you don't get any cheese without a mousetrap. Не бывает сыра без мышеловки. And this went very, very deep. And that made people feel that, yes, the West wants to exploit us as well. We are victims. We are surrounded by enemies everywhere. And that made them very, very open to these sorts of narratives, because tomorrow there'll be new narratives. We shouldn't get too, today it's the children of Soros. Tomorrow it'll be the nieces of Bill Gates. It doesn't matter. There'll be a new one tomorrow. And people are very, very open to it. And they're very, very open to these sorts of messages. And we found that this was deeply linked often to people's sense of agency. They sensed they personally couldn't control very much in the world. They'd been through traumatic experiences through the 1990s, through the 2000s. They felt generally that they had very, very low agency and very low ways of controlling the world around them. They were very defensive, just trying to defend their own little patch. It was very interesting talking to people who were more self-confident, often from the cities, often more successful, would say, look, we don't understand these narratives. They might be true, but I don't believe them because I control my own life. Yeah, I don't believe any of this conspiracy stuff a priori because I'm in control of my life. So it was much more about the sense of agency, self-worth, and empowerment. So very quickly, this is a very deep issue to look at in Ukraine. Ukraine has incredibly high levels of conspiratorial mindsets. We found 68% of Ukrainians overall have what we call conspiratorial mindsets. I mean, that's almost twice as more, well, that's significantly more than in Hungary, which we polled recently, and Hungary is pretty bad as well. So this is a real issue in Ukraine. And that makes the whole country very, very rife for this sort of new generation pro-Kremlin propaganda. However, there are positive things. I'll be very brief. Even though people have this sort of view of the world where everybody is out to get them, in this dog-eat-dog world, the Kremlin is easily the most evil dog. So even though they are worried about everyone, they're most worried about Russia. So 61% of Ukrainians see Russia as the biggest threat to Ukraine. So I suppose you could just work with this feeling, saying, yes, it is a dog-eat-dog world. It is evil out there. Everybody wants to exploit you, but Russia is the nastiest dog out there. So in a world of big bad dogs, it's better to be with NATO than with Russia. I'm certainly not recommending that, but that might, if you're a stratcoms person in the Ukrainian government, maybe that's the sort of thing you might consider. I mean, obviously, that's not what I would advocate myself. I think we do have to think much more long-term, much more deeply, and really think about how we work with a sense of a lack of empowerment. And there is, of course, deep trust in Ukraine towards horizontal institutions, towards civil society, the church, and so on. There is something to build on. Yeah, that people do see agents of change that they trust. So our kind of big kind of recommendations, and I'll is to kind of, from a narrative point of view, try to talk to people and engage them on the topic of, yes, we live in a very, very tough world, but how do you strengthen that survival by building a stronger state, by building a more democratic state, by integrating with the West in some ways? How do you link your personal survival with the broader questions of national survival and integration into the international community? I think there's a lot that can be done actually from government agencies and also from international agencies, sort of explaining to people that reforms are not just about pain, which is a lot of the narrative at the moment. You will experience pain and later it'll be better. I'm not sure that's a very strong narrative to people who've gone through a lot of pain already, but really explaining that the reforms are there to strengthen society, to make it more resistant to outside aggression. And thinking even more deeply and more systemically, how can you design government and media that helps empower people? Two very simple suggestions. One of them, really going with the rhetoric of the present government, who say they want to strengthen online government initiatives. That could be a way of strengthening people's sense of empowerment. And just take something as simple as local municipal budget making. You could get the local populations, local cities, local civic actors involved in municipal budget making. There's a strong track record of this from Brazil through to North Africa, and lots of things show that that helps people's sense of self-empowerment. They're involved in local governance through very, very tangible things. And if we're talking about what can media do, we really recommend a shift toward what is now being sometimes labeled engagement media or social media, where you're not simply beaming information down to people, you're actually getting them engaged in the media context. I don't mean civil or civic journalism, which I think is a complete red herring and a joke. I mean much more structural things. For example, trying to find out from people which agendas they want addressed, welcoming them into the newsroom, using various online tools to find out the questions that they want answered. There's lots and lots of initiatives that you could look at, but it's a real shift of media thinking of itself not as somebody lecturing down to people, but actually being a service, and often a service that helps delivery of social help as well. Anyway, I'll stop there. I've probably gone on too long, but yeah, thank you for hearing me out. And the full report with all the boring details about weighting and sample sizes is on the Iryna website. Go to irinaresearch.org.
Thank you. Wow, that was great. Thank you, boss. And this was Dmytro Shymkiv and then Peter Pomerantsev, that from a very different angle that I would have thought. I didn't really know this from this side. I will, I'll throw out some questions, but because people already start asking questions, I actually wanted to jump in on this. So the first question is, please explain who are the children of Soros. And I wanted actually to comment on that, because I can proudly say that I'm one of the children of Soros.
Okay. So listen,
I'm officially one of the children of Soros, but like in a very direct manner. I went, my first endeavor, my first travel outside of Ukraine was actually to Budapest, to a Soros-sponsored educational institution. It was from a very dark Ukraine that, as Dmytro might remember, but kind of when there were energy, when in the late 90s, when there was no electricity, and then you move from this very dark post-Soviet space to a very bright building in the center of Budapest that was all paid by Soros. So that's
well, there you are. There's your answer.
Somewhat generously, right? Well, the problem is, a lot of us ended up on, so to speak, on the wrong side of the ocean, right? I don't know how many of the children of Soros are still left on the other side of the ocean, right? Or what's the correlation? But
so what it is, it's the Ukrainian version of the same narrative you see across the world now, that George Soros controls societies from behind the scenes through support for civil society organizations. Now, this narrative is obviously very strong in America. It's very strong in Hungary. Overall, I think it's failed in Ukraine. I think it's failed for two reasons in Ukraine. A, people haven't heard of George Soros. He isn't this household name, and people are like, who are you talking about? And I think also in Ukraine, people still see a Western philanthropist as less of a problem than a local oligarch. There isn't that kind of like, and we can think about historically why that is, why there isn't this prejudice. But it just doesn't quite work. They're like, oh, it's compared to local, this real hostility towards local oligarchs. It's hard to think of some sort of like a New York financier as this great, as a collective symbol of everything that you fear. So I think my sense is that narrative actually not worked very well in Ukraine. People in focus groups were just confused what Soros meant, just as the person who asked the question is. But however, the idea that there are dark hidden forces all around us manipulating us, that underlying structure, narrative structure, is popular.
Thank you. So, and
Iryna, can I add?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Well, as a Soros student, I can comment as well. I got my first scholarship also from Soros, and I also worked with Soros when I was in the government. So, but I think, Peter, there's one case which I have to contradict you. Unfortunately, a lot of pro-Western thinking people in a different establishment in Ukraine and in a even business group still have a narrative that there are hidden people of Soros in the government, in the political, in the business elite who are playing or masterminding things. It's still been replicated in the media. It's still been replicated in conversations behind media, without media. I've been very often been thrown in the conversation where I'm meeting business people. So I would not write it out as the narrative that was not, that seeds of which have not been growing. So it's unfortunately that there is a still conspiracy theory that Soros in his age is capable to influence the behavior of a country, but people still like to cherish this idea. Not only Medvedchuk, but also people who are against Medvedchuk. So this needs to be taken into account as well.
Thank you.
That's the sort of elite focus groups we didn't do, but that's very, very upsetting to hear, because I had hoped that the people pushing this were cynical and were just doing it as a game. And to hear that there are elites who are genuinely possessed of this,
yes,
that sounds like a separate study we need to do. Elite's belief in conspiracy theories, because we were looking at the population, and that's a fascinating subject. I mean, to what extent did the elites really believe this stuff? In Russia, they do, of course. I think the Patrushevs and Putins of this world are very conspiratorial. That is their worldview, and it's very sad to hear that might be true of Ukraine as well.
Okay, so I will use my authority and ask the first big question, and I'll be very authoritarian from now on. But I also like to invite the audience to post questions, and we have 3 as of now. But we'll kind of as we speak, please feel free to post write your questions in the Q&A, and then I'll post them to the speaker. But I would like to ask you to reflect on kind of one broad question. So we've been talking about like different forms of cyber security or cyber war and propaganda, So and my question is, or like my well, like I would like to ask you to reflect on the relationship kind of between Eastern Europe or Ukraine specifically and the US, right? Because we all know, something happened in the US over the past, I'm not going to give the exact date, right? But over, 2-3 years, that people actually start realizing that all this electronic hacking is a real thing and propaganda is a real thing, right? Now, I tend to think, or at least I would think that, in Eastern Europe, or at least in Ukraine, we had experienced it slightly earlier. So one question, there is different aspect of questions. So one question is that, like, what is the correlations of what is the movement, right? What was first, the chicken or the eggs, right? So, and how come this relationship between what happened in Ukraine and what happened in the US, how can we define this relationship, the kind of the international propaganda and the role of Ukraine in all of this, if that makes sense?
Maybe I'll start. There was a group being created by Ukrainian students in Kyiv-Mohyla Academy called Stop Fake. It's an interesting group which was particularly studying the fakes, how they've been circulated and how they've been spreading. And one of the things that happened in 2014 in Ukraine, Russian propaganda was experimenting with the size of the size of the fake in the news. So and they were looking what is the tolerance of nonsense in the news, where people start believing in that nonsense. So, for example, we had a case where Ukrainian soldiers were crucifying the kid in the village. Total nonsense, but there are still groups of people believing it. And then they could go one way to amplify nonsense and see to what extent the society is perceptive and what groups of the society will believe in this. And then they understand that there is a significant portion of society do not believe. Then they will reduce the level of nonsense, but still bringing, and then they will find a balance. They were studying, they were actually experimenting on Ukraine, to which extent they can bring a nonsense into the stories or in the news, and to which nonsense people will be believing, and then using this further. How it later this will be reused in US. In order to spread the fake, you give a truth, and within a truth, you slightly amend things or make some fake things inside the story. So people who generally believe in the truth, they gradually will believe in a bit of fake, especially those fake which contributes to the political benefits of the offender. Another point is the activists or active people in the society. In Ukraine, as in Russia, by the way, you need to split them. When they are united, they are strong force which can be an opposition to some of the political agenda that the Rouge player has. So how you can do it? If you can split them. Russia did it with having access to VK and basically attacking the opposition groups and creating a split in the opposition groups within the Russia. In Ukraine, you can actually create a fake and try to instill a conflict within the activist group, so they start fighting inside each other. It's very strategic. It's been invented by KGB and also by Tsar Formulovs to address the revolutionary back in beginning in 1900. Same approach. You infiltrate and you split. And you can use technology today to do exactly the same. How it's been, all these experiments and practices later been used in US. If you can segment the society, if you can hijack and access there and distribute SMS or messaging, if you understand how different people respond to different activities, if you try to understand what audience watch Russia Today in US, and then experiment. And when you find out what works, then you just lend it at the moments when you need it, when you need it politically, when you have a political agenda, and then you try to use social infrastructure, social fabric of people, and cyber to amplify this, spread it, because cyber is just a tool.
Thank you. Peter, would you like to jump in, or?
Listen, I mean, look. So your question is to be why is stuff happening in America and Ukraine at the same time?
What's the relationship? What's the flaw? Is there any kind of relationship, in the way that propaganda spreads, or the way that we perceive the role of propaganda, between you in between, so to speak, in Europe?
Yeah. So I mean, it's funny. I have a whole chapter in my last book about that. So listen, I remember interviewing for my last book. Gleb Pavlovsky, who I'm sure many of you know. He was a dissident who became a spin doctor from Odessa, actually. Dissident in Soviet times, was arrested and even served some time for dissident activities, and then kind of moved to the dark side in the 1990s and became a kind of a spin doctor, an elections manager, and worked on the Yeltsin campaign of 96, then the Putin campaign of 99, then came down and did some horrible work in Ukraine for Yanukovych and before the Orange Revolution, and has since then redefected, sort of fallen out with the Kremlin again, and is now something of a liberal, and likes to give interviews. But he's what's interesting about him is he comes from a philosophical background, and he's very good at mixing philosophy and propaganda. And discussing it from the side, even as he's part of it, and he put it quite well. That the West is now going through the processes that countries like Russia and Ukraine went through in the early 1990s. I mean, processes to do with the collapse of social roles, the collapse of economic certainties, and the collapse of clear ideologies of left and right, and that paves the way for certain types of propaganda which work on audiences, which we've seen, I think, for a long time, pursued in Russia and pushed by Russia to the countries around it. We now see them popular in what we once thought of as the West. So when you have no more clear ideologies of left and right, when social roles disappear, you have to reinvent social categories. Like you invent an idea of the Putin majority. You see the idea of the people being invented really as a new category by spin doctors in all sorts of places in the West, and then stuffing very, very, very different types of frustrations and psychological impulses inside of them. You see a politics that's based less on clear ideas of the future and evidence, which kind of disappears when ideas of the future disappear from public discourse as they have now from the West, as they did in Russia in the 1990s, and you have kind of nostalgia becoming one of the dominant modes. And we go on and on and on. And are they connected to each other? I mean, I suppose you could argue that a lot of the West's ideas around its kind of political ideologies and propaganda ideologies were kind of rooted inside a Cold War conflict. So we could talk about a left and right with kind of, the Cold War as a sort of defining compass and all of that. And when Russia disappears as the other, all our inner contradictions kind of heightened as well. But I mean, that's one way of thinking about it if you're going to get dialectical, I suppose. But just putting it more simply, the kind of idea of a warm, fuzzy, globalized future with no more politics and just a technocracy that was heading towards some sort of utopia formulated by the front cover of The Economist has sort of collapsed very, 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 very obviously. And we are in this moment of flux. And that in some ways is similar to what happened in I suppose, I don't like the term, the former Soviet Union in the 1990s. So we're now in the West reliving the 1990s. And so maybe there are some sort of similarities and trends which are repeating.
Thank
I don't know
you.
if that was the question you asked me, by the way, but I've answered it that way.
It is actually, it is, yeah. I mean, yeah, thank you, and it's, it brings a lot. So I would like to kind of now take kind of questions, not randomly, but in the order that I think they're important. So one is from Maria Genkin to Dmytro, and I would like to ask to keep your answer, both of you, to keep your answer very, very brief, because we have a fair amount of questions, so I would like to address some of them. So the question reads the following: to Dmytro, we know that US has team working covertly to have the capability to attack Russia and other adversaries on cyber war front. Are there these teams in Ukraine, and have they had any successes?
In order to answer very shortly, there are teams from Department of Energy and FBI and other agencies that have been, with whom we've been cooperating on investigating incidents in Ukraine, which later, knowledge of which been later used to prevent similar incidents or similar approaches in US. I personally worked with this team and visited some of the facilities in US that are working on preventing especially energy protection of the energy grid. There was a lot of cooperation around this topic in Ukraine. So there is a cooperation, but nothing aggressive today. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so a question from one of my students, Alexa Milojevic. What kinds of techniques and methods are used in order to attribute and trace back certain attacks to pro-Kremlin groups in general? How effective are these methods? And what percentage of the attacks Mr. Shymkiv mentioned have the proofs of Kremlin involvement in them?
The primary, it's about attribution. It's usually this the way how the cyber folks will talk about this is who is the main beneficiary of the consequences of the attack. And when you look at the primary beneficiary, especially if there is no ransom asked, or for example, attack on the political infrastructure or attack on the energy infrastructure or the financial infrastructure, which is initially we thought that NotPetya was primary just primary virus attack. But when the code was investigated on the performances, we identified that the intelligence gathering was the primary objective of the operation, not actually destroying the infrastructure. So when we talk about beneficiary, that's what happened. One case that happened when the National Security and Defense Council banned OK and VK Russian social networks in Ukraine. Yandex Group made a very creative statement to their subscribers, posting immediately at their after working hours posts, creating a social engineered attack on the critical infrastructure of the presidential administration, where the flow of the clicks on the petition side exceeded anything imaginable. My team, we worked half of the night to defend the infrastructure. We survived, but this was when next morning on the press conference, I mentioned that this was orchestrated attack coming directly from Kremlin. Suddenly, within 30 minutes, I get a public response from Peskov saying there is no proof that this is coming from Russia. Suddenly, very, very quickly, a response from the speaker of the president of Russia.
Okay, thank you. So another question, I don't know whom it's addressed to, but what changes do you see from Marta Dechok? What changes do you see in Russia's disinformation campaign against Ukraine during the Zelensky presidency, if any? What changes do you see in Russia's disinformation campaign?
Sure. Well, I mean, look, so what we're seeing is, I mean, I think this push of not being so much pro-Russian, but just undermining trust in the West and making the West look as bad as Russia, I think is the overall trend. Then obviously we have everything around COVID-19. Then we would have had, things around, remember when Russian troops were massing on the borders of Ukraine during summer. So look, it changes all the time depending on the situation. But the strategic direction is this: not be so much pro-Russian as make the West look just as bad as Russia and undermine the reform process as much as possible. So playing also on things that Ukraine should be neutral, the real meaning of sovereignty is being neutral, therefore not, those sorts of narratives. I think that's the overall trend. Plus, obviously, COVID-19 has been a huge area of disinformation across the world, including from Russia. So it's always developing. It's always changing with the situation.
Just to add on this, it's quite difficult to attack personality when there is a high support rating. Zelensky had a very high support rating in the society, so attacks on him, the groups within the society that were ready to accept negativity on Zelensky was very limited. He had a 75% support against the population, which is still pretty high. Today it's around 50. So we need to take this into account when they're launching any attack on any personality or action. So as Peter said, it's COVID-19, it's all mistakes that might happen.
Thank you. Another question from DH. I don't know whether it's a acronym or what, just abbreviation, but I think it's an interesting question. A question about weaponized fakes and disinformation. Are there any studies or ideas regarding the influence of the central or local governmental inefficiency or irresponsibility on priming the atmosphere of distrust? Is it a factor that can be considered a major one? Any specific recommendations? Basically asking about, talking about the local government, not the state as a whole, but local agencies.
What happened during the was decentralization reform, a significant portion of the funding are now going to the region. And if previously the narrative that everything is taken by central government and then it's stolen, suddenly could not be propagated anymore because, again, significant amount went to the regions. Regions actually investing, and the easiest way to invest is in infrastructure, parks, pavements, etc. So actually people start seeing that money actually going to the region and there is a construction going on. And that's simplified. I haven't seen much of the conversation anymore on the regional dispersion in Ukraine and then disinformation on the regional level. It could happen primarily on East and South Ukraine on the marginal groups, but it's not working anymore, especially understanding the dynamics of the society. I mean, we all did 7 years in the war, so we actually get used to the aggression and disinformation.
Okay, so another question is from Iryna Chalupa. Could this tendency to believe in conspiracies be a remnant of the Soviet experience? After all, in those days, the individual had almost no control over his life, and the ruling system rendered him insignificant and largely powerless. I think we addressed a little bit of that, but maybe you want to expand.
I mean, you would think so, but then again, we see different parts of society reacting differently, and it has been, we do have a whole generation now who've grown up post-Soviet. So yeah, it would be very interesting looking at the roots of it. Certainly the rhetoric is up in the Kuratere, feels very, very old school. There's a bit of nostalgia to it. And look, conspiracy theories were a big part of Soviet rhetoric. I think there's an Ivan Krastev book basically arguing that Marxism is a conspiracy theory because, it looks for this sort of demonic bourgeoisie that's in charge of all the ills of the world. So there's lots of stuff that we can go back into and go back to Tsarist times, as Dmytro mentioned. So there's lots of layers there that we could unpeel. So yeah, probably. That's probably my answer, but we haven't sort of studied that in any disciplined way.
And conspiracy theories exist everywhere in the world. There's always groups of the society in the different parts of the world which love to believe in some part of conspiracy. US, Europe, you could find it, especially if there are tensions or ethnical tensions or nationality or regional tensions in the society. We look at the Catalonia and Spain, which would be actively used by Russia using Venezuela servers to broadcast on the Spanish to kind of trigger the society behavior in Catalonia when there was a uprising for independence.
Thank you. Okay, so another question is from Alex Sinyavsky, and it's a longer question, so I'll just try to read it so we all get a grasp of it. Any advice on how to counter people that bring up Nord Stream 2? That seems to be the ultimate example of dog eat dog, where Germany, a cut-off EU country, have just eaten Ukraine pipe for lunch. With all the income and the security that were embedded in it. I kind of failed to find a way to deal with it myself. Thank you.
Well, I also have difficulty dealing with it myself, as well as the majority of Ukrainians. I think that remember that I brought the case of Austria, the explosion in Austria, the voting in the German parliament was surprisingly the Green Party abstained. The Green Party, which should be usually not supporting anything going on the sea that can contaminate the nature, abstained. So I think there's a lot of financial interests in the story. And when you have a former counselor serving the Russian Gazprom, it's quite difficult. And we see what's happening now.
Thank you. Now, a very quick and kind of technical question from Marta Dechok. Has Mr. Shymkiv published anything on what he presented today? I would like to use it in my writing. Would be great for references. Thank you.
Part of it was used in the documentary on HBO, and then there is a Perfect Weapon book by David Singer, where there is a part of my story, especially not-bets, have been interviewed. I've been interviewed for this case. But all the other cases, I would be happy. You can reach me on the Facebook. I will be happy to comment or give into you on this.
Thank you. Okay, so there are a few more questions left. A question from Christian Randolph. The COVID-19 pandemic has been fraught with conspirational propaganda from many sources with varying agendas, such as occasions when Russia alluded to the virus being created by the US military. Have this campaign had any meaningful success in Ukraine? Has this compound with previous belief to alter attitudes in any significant way? I think the main question here is if the belief that the Russian kind of claims that US was somehow involved in creating this virus has any kind of impact, has any kind of taken on in Ukraine.
No, it was not about the fake stories were circulating more about the Chinese than actually about the Americans. At the same time, if you look at the vaccination rate in Ukraine, it's actually not very high. And the significant portion of people who are anti-vax in Ukraine are leveraging narratives which been spread as well in Russia, is about the trust towards vaccines, the quality of clinical testing, and blah, 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 as well as to mRNA story in general. And this, as I mentioned, you don't, in Russia or any propaganda machines today, they become more sophisticated. You need to to spread the nonsense. You need to spread a bit of nonsense, that a bit of this nonsense looked almost like a truth. And a lot of people would believe in this, basically because of the lack of knowledge, because of it was shared by your friends. And especially if there is many of the young people or popular people like to have more subscribers. Somebody knock, you add it. Then gradually over the 3 to 6 months, you start liking the post of that person because he likes your posts. And then gradually you start sharing this. So it's at average between 3 to 6 months up to 9, you become friend with the bot and you start sharing things that the bot injecting in you. Unfortunately, we're all humans. We need to understand that the elements of the human pieces of trust towards other people actually influence our behavior and what we share, what we post. So critical thinking works, but also remembering who do you really know the person that you share stories with?
Yeah, so I think, the COVID, and I can speak, of course, from personal experience, COVID and Ukraine is it's a story in itself. I think Ukrainians believe in, in garlic and, I don't know, like all kind of old parochial methods, and no virus can take us, of course, even though so many people died, and especially in April, but that's a different story. So we have, I think maybe last questions from Maria Genkin again to Peter. So what would be corresponding non-obvious narratives in US discourse now that can be traced back to Russia?
Maria, great question. I just haven't been, doing the latest OSINT trawling through the dark side of the American internet. You'll always find something crazy there. But a lot of things have been around COVID disinformation the last year. So I'm sure, I don't know whether the Russians are just jumping on them and trying to augment them, whether they're seeding them. It's always that initial attribution is very, very, very hard to do. And there's a lot of problems with that always. But look, and I think overall, it's so much about Russia seeding narratives. Largely, they do what every propagandist does, is they attach themselves to narratives, curate a community, and then put the narratives they care about. So what we should really be worried about is them embedding themselves in the anti-vax community and dropping in stories about Nord Stream, about Ukraine, about Syria. I know that sounds very old-fashioned, but really that really is the ABC of propaganda, attaching yourself to a community, winning their trust on what they already believe, and then attaching your stories, especially in something which has so much of its own propaganda as America. So, it's just bizarre when, I remember back, it was ages ago, but suddenly all these like pro-Trump people were on Russia's side in the fights over whether Russia had used drugs during the Olympics. I mean, because Russia just curated, got to know these people, befriended them in the ways that Dmytro talked about online and said, well, you can't trust the elites at the Olympic Committee either, can you? And so it's pretty, if you know Russia, it's pretty obvious which things they're seeding. They're the ones that coincide with Russia's foreign policy priorities. But I'm sure there's other stuff, if you spend enough time in the dank parts of the internet, you'll always find some bizarre Russian operation. And then often, we get to know about it when it's way too late, when it becomes a big deal. But I can't say I'm doing that right now. I did that for a couple of years, and at one point you're like, you want to move on from just always seeing what the bad guys are up to seeing what we can do on a positive way as well.
Thank you very much. I'll just say, we'd like to conclude maybe with kind of a few notes, or maybe just very brief note from my side that, so what I had in mind for this panel is I wanted to draw attention to several things that happened in Ukraine, but that are very relevant to the US, right? So this is an attempt for me to bring to focus Eastern Europe, but specifically Ukraine, and its relevance, not just to Europe, but to the world community in large. And I think what came out here very clearly is that it's not just, it's not just our parochial experience, and I can speak for myself, the trauma of like starving grandparents, right? And the trauma of the 1990s, right? But this is the general tendency of people, even the very educated people, to fall for propaganda, right? It's universal across ethnic, across and geographical divide. But I think the lessons, one of the subtitle in this panel was the lessons from Ukraine should be very relevant to the US, not the way around, right? So we went through something that US is actually only start encountering very recently. We've been we experienced it for a slightly perhaps longer due to specific circumstances, like, and a lot of people implied here without actually saying it out loud, but the war experience actually changed it all. And luckily in this country, at least by kind of sitting here in Jersey, right, we don't really have this experience of the war, but we experience a different kind of crisis that Peter actually in the post-Dmytro Peter addressed. So I would like very much to thank our panelists for this great discussion, and then I would like also to thank all the people who stayed with us, not only through the presentations, but also through the Q&A. I would like personally to thank Maria Genkin, who helped put it together, and an old and good time friend from New York, from my old good days in New York, in the city when we used to do these events, several per week. And also I'd like to advertise what's going to happen, what's going to happen coming forward. This is just the beginning, hopefully, right? Hopefully I will have the energy to stay with this. On October 27, at the same time, Wednesday, October 27, also over Zoom, we'll have a panel on literature and war in Ukraine. So please stay tuned. And we'll send an announcement, of course. And thank you very much for Katya Privilova and the Russian and East European Center, East European and Eurasian Center for supporting us. And stay tuned. Thank you. And I guess it's exactly 6, so I will probably just leave the stop it now. Okay. Have a good night, all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.